This video will be for a princess seam. So you'll have two pattern pieces for this one. You'll have your front bodice, and this one it says it's for the princess sample. You'll need to piece it together and then just cut one large piece. Make sure to snip into all of your notches, including the one that's right on the line at center front neckline. And then we will have a cut 2 of the side bodice. So this is the side bodice. You'll need to cut one face up and then another face down. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is prepare our side bodice to go onto our pattern piece, or to go onto our center front piece. So if we take a look at this pattern piece, there are 2 notches around the bust area. This curve is the part of the seam that will go right over the tip of our bust. So we need to put an easing stitch in here, because whenever we piece these together, this side bodice will have slightly more length than the center front bodice between those 2 notches. And the reason for that is just to help create that 3D curved shape that goes over the bust. So these 2 notches are slightly further apart than these 2. So we're going to go ahead and put an easing stitch in between those 2 notches on both of our side bust pieces. It'll be at 3/8 of an inch. Our finished stitch line is going to be a 1/2 inch, so we want it a little bit less than that so that it sits inside the seam allowance. So I'm going to go at 3/8 of an inch. If your machine does not have a 3/8 inch marking, you can go in between the 1/2 and the 1/4 inch. Okay, for our ease stitch, it's going to be done just like a basting stitch that we do for gathers. We need long tails to start with, and then we're going to put our stitch length up to a 4 so that it's nice and loose. So I'm pushing mine up to a 4, and then we're just going to stitch at 3/4 inch, or sorry, 3/8 of an inch, right between those 2 notches. So I'm going to start where my first notch is, right here. And my machine has that 3/8 inch marking, so I'm using that. But again, if yours does not, you can go in between the 1/4 and the 1/2 inch. We're just going to follow that curve until we get down to that second notch. And then we can stop, make sure to pull out some long tails and cut that off. So we'll do that for both pieces. Okay, so here are my 2 finished side bodices with that easing stitch in between the notches. Now we're ready to start pinning this to our center front bodice. So I'm going to grab my center front bodice, and then we'll pin one at a time, right sides together, so you can see how this curve is going to fit together once we're done. But we're going to put those right sides together. You should have these opposing curves whenever you flip it. So I'm going to pin the areas that should match up straight first. So from this bottom corner up to that first notch. So make sure to match that notch and the corner first, and then you can pin in between. But there shouldn't be any ease in this area. And same with that little portion that is above the notch. I'm going to pull it over. Your notch should match up perfectly. And then see how this corner has been cut off so that it'll match up with the corner of your center front bodice. Now I'm going to pin in between where this curve is. So I can begin to pull on my easing stitch. I'm just going to pick one of the tails, start to pull on that and gather it up a little bit. We don't want to gather it so much that it's tucking, but we do want to pull on it so that we start to pull in some of that extra length. And then we can use that and roll it over our finger. So the one with more fabric goes on top. So in this case, that's the side bodice. goes on top, and then you can roll it over your finger or around your finger to help take up some of that extra fullness. And then when I pin, I'm going to pin right around that stitch line. So I'm not pinning all the way to the raw edge. I'm just going in and out right by that stitch line, keeping it close to that stitch line. Because what we want to do is have that stitch line be nice and flat to our center front bodice, so that when we stitch it, we don't get any tucks in that stitch line. But what that'll do is it creates a wave on the raw edge of the side front bodice. We don't want to flatten out that wave because that will cause tucks. It'll push that fullness back to the stitch line, and it'll cause tucks on the stitch line. So as long as your stitch line is nice and flat, it's okay if the raw edge is waving. I'm going to go ahead and pin my other one while we're here. Okay, now both of those are pinned, so I'm going to take this over to my machine and we're going to stitch this at 1/2 inch. Okay, back at the machine, we want to make sure to push our stitch length back down to 2.5 so that we are doing a permanent stitch. And then when we stitch this, we're going to put the one with more fullness on bottom. So in this case, that is the side bodice is going to sit on bottom, and I've got my center front bodice sitting on top. And we're going to stitch this at 1/2 inch using a permanent stitch, so there will be a back stitch at the beginning and end. And then as I get to that area where the fullness is at, I can begin to curve my fabric up as I feed it into the machine so that it's being fed into the machine at an angle. Okay. So I'm feeling my fabric that's right in front of the foot with my fingers as I stitch to make sure that I don't feel any tucks forming underneath there. And I'm checking my raw edges to make sure that they stay even. Okay, we're now at that second notch, so I'm back to an area with no fullness. So now I can just feed it into the machine nice and flat. Okay, we're going to do the same to the other side. Okay, before you move on to the next step, make sure to check your stitching and make sure that there are no tucks that formed in that easing area. And then once you've ensured that there are no tucks, you can go ahead and pull on the tails of that easing stitch to take it out. And it should come out pretty easily since we did a nice loose stitch. Okay, now we're gonna move on to pressing this and clipping. So before we can press, we need to make sure we clip in this area. So you can see we'll have one side that has too much fabric. You can see how it's waving. So when I start to push it over here, it has too much fabric and it's gonna start folding over on itself. The other side doesn't have enough fabric. It's really nice, it's really taut whenever I try to spread it out to that other side. So on the side with too much fabric, we are going to take away triangles. We're gonna clip so that we're cutting away little triangles of fabric and removing some of that extra fullness. The tighter your curve, the closer together these triangles will get. Mine right now are about 1/2 inch apart. But if I had a tighter curve, I could get them closer together. Okay, so we'll take away that extra fabric. On the other side, we need to just do slits. So we're gonna do little slashes or slits into our fabric, which will allow it to spread as we press it to the other side. Okay, and I'm just doing it in that fullness area because that's a curve. So now we can put this on our ham. Try to match that curve on your ham, so you may have to adjust the placement to where your ham fully fills out that curve, and then you can begin to bust it open and press it. Okay, so this is what your princess seam should be looking like once it's fully pressed. And on the other side, you should have a nice flat seam, or flat in the sense that both of those two sides are fully separated, but it will start to form a 3D curve over where the bust will lay. I'm gonna go ahead and press the other side, clip and press the other side, and then we'll be done. Okay, there's my finished sample of the princess seam from the inside and from the outside. And you should see how it's standing off the table and creating 3D form where those princess seams curve over the bust.